There are things in this world that look like nothing. A cracked stone by the road, a folded envelope in a drawer, an old wooden chest that smells of cedar, and something older, something that resists naming. People walk past them every day, certain they already know their value, certain the world has already sorted everything into what matters and what does not. Clara Voss had spent most of her life being put in the second category. She was used to it. She had grown up in the shadow of louder voices, quicker opinions, sharper elbows. But she had also grown up sitting on the floor beside her grandmother's linen chest, listening to the old woman hum while folding sheets that carried the faint scent of lavender and something older still. Something that had always felt, to Clara, like a secret told in another language. And she would think about that later, about how some things whisper before they speak, about how the truth does not always arrive with noise. It was a Tuesday in early March when the call came. Clara was standing at the back counter of the diner where she worked the morning shift, 2 plates in her hand and a coffee pot in the crook of her arm, when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She set everything down carefully, the way she always did, with the kind of deliberateness that comes from spending years making sure nothing spills, nothing breaks, nothing costs more than you can afford. Her brother's name was on the screen. Daniel. She already knew what it meant before she answered. Their grandmother, Magdalena Voss, had died the night before. She was 83. She had been fading since autumn, since the doctor had said so plainly in the kind of voice that people use when they want to be kind, but have run out of softness. The body, he had explained, simply grows tired of the work. Clara had driven the 2-hour stretch of highway to visit as often as she could manage, which was not often enough. She told herself it was the distance. She told herself it was the hours. She told herself a great many things in those months, the way people do when they cannot afford the full weight of the truth. She told her manager she needed the rest of the week and drove home to her apartment, where her daughter, Lily, age 9, was already at school. The apartment was small, on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of cooking oil and old carpet, in a part of town where the streetlights sometimes worked and sometimes did not. Clara sat down at the kitchen table and did not cry right away. She looked at the window, at the gray March light pressing through the glass, and thought about her grandmother's hands. The way they moved when she folded things, the particular way she smoothed a crease, twice, always, twice, as though the first pass were doubt and the second were certainty. The grief came later that night, quiet and thorough, the kind that does not announce itself with drama but simply settles, the way sediment settles in still water. The house in Grantford was 4 hours north, in the kind of small town where the hardware store had been the same family for 3 generations, and the coffee at the diner was terrible. But no one said so because the woman who made it had been making it for 40 years. So Magdalena Voss had lived in that house for nearly 6 decades. She had raised 4 children in it, outlived her husband by 22 years, and kept the garden even after her knees made bending difficult. The house was modest, 2 stories, white paint that needed attention, a porch with a wooden swing that creaked on windy days. Inside, it smelled the way old houses do when someone has loved them for a long time, of wood and wool and something faintly sweet that Clara had never been able to identify. The family arrived over the following days. Daniel came up from the city with his wife, Patricia, who wore expensive shoes that caught on the porch floorboards and spent most of the visit on her phone. Renata, the older sister, arrived from the suburbs with her husband, Greg, who spoke loudly about property values and always seemed to be calculating something just behind his eyes. Clara drove up with Lily, who sat quietly in the back seat and looked out at the bare fields passing the window and asked only once whether Nana had been afraid. Clara thought about that for a long time before she answered. She said she didn't think so, that Nana had been ready, which was true in the way that many true things are only partly true. The house felt enormous without her grandmother in it, which made no sense, because the woman had been small, 5 feet 2 inches in her good shoes, but her absence occupied every room. Clara caught herself listening for her, the shuffle of slippered feet on the hallway floor, the particular rattle of the kettle. The silence where those sounds should have been was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The will was read on the 3rd day. A local attorney named Harwick, who had been their grandmother's lawyer for 20 years and smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, sat at the dining room table and read through the document in a measured voice, while Daniel drummed his fingers on the wood and Renata turned the pages of an old magazine without reading it. The house was to be sold, the proceeds divided equally among the 4 children. The furniture, the contents, the various accumulations of a long life were to be distributed by agreement among the family, with any disputes settled by a local mediator, whose name no one would ever need because disputes in polite families, the attorney said with a dry half-smile, rarely require mediation. What followed was not polite. It began the way these things always begin, with someone saying they only wanted what was fair and meaning something else entirely. Daniel had his eye on the dining set, a solid oak table, and 8 chairs that a dealer in the city had once valued at roughly $14,000. He mentioned this twice, the number landing like a coin on the table. Renata wanted the silver, the real silver, not the plated stuff, and the oil painting in the hallway that had supposedly been done by an artist of some local note in the 1960s. Patricia, Daniel's wife, moved through the upstairs rooms with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory, opening drawers, examining the undersides of chairs, asking about the provenance of things. So Clara stood in the doorway of her grandmother's bedroom and felt something close to nausea. She had not come here for furniture. She had not come to calculate. She had come because her grandmother had been the first person in Clara's life who had ever looked at her as though she were enough, exactly as she was, without needing to become something else. She had come to be in the rooms where that had happened, before those rooms were emptied and sold and turned into someone else's story. On the 2nd evening, while Daniel and Greg had gone to the local bar, and Renata was on the phone with her accountant, and Patricia was making a list of things she wanted shipped to the city, Clara sat down on the floor of her grandmother's bedroom beside the linen chest. It stood against the wall near the window, where it had always stood. Waist high, roughly 4 feet long, built of dark wood that had been polished so many times, its grain had taken on the quality of still water. The hinges were old iron, patinated brown. The hasp was iron too, simple and unadorned, with a small keyhole that Clara had never seen, locked in all her years of visiting. There was a faint carving along the top edge, a repeating pattern of small flowers that she had traced with her finger as a child so many times she could still feel the shape of them without looking. She opened it carefully. Inside was what had always been inside, folded linen, the smell of cedar and lavender rising with the lid. Pillowcases, embroidered at the edges in pale blue thread. A tablecloth that had appeared every Christmas. 2 long runners that had dressed the hallway table on holidays. On top of these, folded separately, was the quilt. Cream and blue, hand-pieced, every square cut by her grandmother's own hands over a winter when Magdalena had been young and just married and had more patience than she would ever again have time for. Clara sat with the quilt in her lap for a long time, pressing her palms against the fabric, feeling the slight raised texture of the stitching. When Renata appeared in the doorway, Clara looked up without moving. "Mom wants that quilt," Renata said, then corrected herself automatically. I want it. It was always in the family." "You can have the quilt," Clara said. She meant it. She placed it gently back inside. Renata's eyes moved to the chest itself. She looked at it the way she looked at most things, with a quick professional assessment. "The chest is probably worth something," she said. "There are dealers who buy these. I'll have Greg look into it." Clara's hand was resting on the lid. She did not move it. "I'd like the chest," she said. There was a pause. The kind of pause that is not really a pause, but a recalculation. "It's old wood," Renata said. "Could be valuable. You should let us have it appraised first." "I'd like the chest," Clara said again. Renata made a small sound through her nose that she probably thought was neutral. "You barely have room in that apartment, Clara. What would you even do with it?" "I'd like the chest," Clara said for the third time, and something in her voice, something flat and final, made Renata shift in the doorway and move on to more interesting negotiations. At dinner that night, when it was settled that Clara would take the linen chest, the response around the table was unanimous in the way that only silent agreements can be unanimous. Daniel looked at his wife. Renata looked at her phone. Greg said something about how sentimental value was still value, and laughed at his own joke. Patricia said generously that it was sweet that Clara wanted to hold on to a memory. Nobody fought her for it. Nobody needed to. In the accounting of that evening, the dining set, the silver, the painting, the good china, the small antique clock, the jewelry that had been in a felt-lined box in the top drawer and which Clara had not known existed until Renata produced it that afternoon. All of these were spoken for before Clara could do more than stand quietly at the edge of the room. She had not expected otherwise. She had learned to arrive late at tables where others had been seated for years. The linen chest was hers. The others took everything else. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep in the small guest room, Clara sat in her grandmother's kitchen and drank tea and tried to remember. She was not angry, or at least she told herself she was not angry, which was close enough to the same thing in practical terms. She was tired. She had been tired for a long time, the kind of tired that does not go away with sleep, but accumulates the way interest accumulates, quietly and without mercy. She worked 2 jobs, the diner in the mornings and a cleaning service 3 evenings a week. She sent Lily to a school that was good enough, but not what she had hoped for. She paid her bills in an order she had worked out over years, toward a careful sequence calibrated to avoid the worst outcomes. She had not taken a vacation since the year before Lily was born. She had not bought herself something she did not need since longer ago than she could clearly remember. Her grandmother had known all of this. In the way that old people sometimes know things without being told, Magdalena had known the shape of Clara's life and had never offered pity, which Clara was grateful for, but had offered presence, which was rarer and worth more. When Clara visited, her grandmother made tea and sat down as though she had been waiting, which perhaps she had been. She asked about Lily with the kind of specific attention that made the child feel seen. She told stories that never seemed to have a moral, but always seemed to contain one. She held Clara's hands when she left and pressed them once. It sounded hard, the way you press something you want to remember. On the last visit, 6 weeks before she died, Magdalena had said something that Clara had filed away without fully understanding. They had been sitting in this same kitchen, tea going cold between them, the early winter light fading through the window. The old woman had looked at the hallway in the direction of her bedroom and said, quietly, as though completing a thought she had been working on for some time, "Some things are meant to find the right person. It takes a while sometimes, but they find them." Clara had nodded and said something like, "Yes," thinking her grandmother meant people, or love, or luck. Now, sitting alone in the kitchen with the house settling around her, she was not sure what the old woman had meant at all. So she drove home 2 days later with the linen chest in the back of her car, wrapped in moving blankets she had borrowed from a neighbor, and the quilt, which Renata had ultimately decided she did not want after all. The chest fit in the cargo space with inches to spare, and the weight of it surprised her. She had expected it to be hollow, but it sat in the car with a solidity that she could feel when she turned corners. A slight pull, as though the car knew something heavy was aboard. The drive back was long. Lily fell asleep early, and Clara drove the dark highway in silence, listening to the tires on the road and the occasional creak from the cargo space behind her. The chest was quiet, which was nothing. It was a box, and boxes were quiet. But the silence had a quality she could not quite dismiss, a density, as though the air around it were slightly more compressed. She told herself she was tired. She told herself she was sad, which was true, and that grief does things to perception, which was also true, and that she was reading significance into the weight of old wood and iron hinges, which was almost certainly true. Almost. Back in the apartment, she and Lily carried the chest up 3 flights of stairs in stages, resting it on each landing. It was heavy in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size, not oppressively so, but consistently, stubbornly, more than expected. Clara chalked it up to the wood, old growth, dense and dark, the kind they didn't mill anymore. She set it against the wall in her bedroom, near the window, because that was where she had always seen it stand, and it seemed right to continue the habit. Lily stood in the doorway and studied it. "It smells like Nana," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "It does." "Can I open it?" "When I've cleaned it out." The girl nodded and went back to the living room, satisfied with this, which was one of the things Clara loved best about her. She accepted provisional answers without bitterness. She understood that some things required waiting. Clara worked the next morning and the morning after that. She cleaned houses on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She called the utilities, called the school about Lily's upcoming field trip and the cost of it, called the landlord about the heating vent in the hallway that had been making a sound for 3 weeks. She moved through the days with the mechanical competence that had kept her functional for years, on doing what needed to be done in the order it needed to be done. The chest sat in her bedroom, and she looked at it each morning and evening, the dark wood catching the light differently at each hour, turning from amber to shadow to a deep, quiet brown. On the Saturday following her return, she finally sat down to properly go through it. She carried the linens out in careful stacks and set them on the bed. The pillowcases, the tablecloth, the runners. She shook each piece gently and refolded them in the way her grandmother had taught her, smoothed each crease twice. At the bottom of the chest, beneath everything, she found 2 more items she had not remembered seeing. A small parcel wrapped in brown paper tied with twine, and a flat piece of folded fabric, darker and heavier than the linens, that she did not immediately recognize. She set them both aside and looked at the empty chest. It was very old. She could see that clearly now, with the contents removed. The interior was lined with a thin layer of faded fabric, ivory once, now the color of old paper, tacked along the edges with small brass tacks. The wood beneath was smooth from decades of use, almost worn to a polish. The smell of cedar was strongest here, clean and dry, with an undertone of something she could not name. Metal, perhaps, or stone, something inorganic. She ran her hands along the interior, feeling for the grain of the wood, for any roughness. The base was smooth, the sides were smooth. She pressed gently on the interior walls. Solid. She pressed on the base. It gave, slightly, a sensation she felt more than heard, a faint compression. Not the compression of padding or of old wood flexing with age, but of something slightly and intentionally yielding, as if designed to suggest solidity while concealing movement. She pressed again, harder, in the center. The same response, a slight, controlled give. She sat back and looked at the chest. The light from the window fell across it at an angle that illuminated small details she had not noticed before. A very faint seam running parallel to the long sides, roughly 2 inches above the base on the interior, barely visible against the lined fabric, the gap no wider than a thread. She leaned closer. Her eyes were not wrong. There was a seam, a straight, deliberate seam, running the full length of the interior, invisible unless the light struck it at precisely the right angle, but invisible unless you were sitting quietly in the right place at the right time of day, and happened to be pressing your palms against the bottom and happened to feel something that should not have moved. She sat for a long time looking at this. The apartment was quiet. Lily had gone to a friend's house 3 blocks away and would not be back until 5. Outside, the street sounds drifted up. A car horn, the laughter of someone passing, the ordinary percussions of a Saturday. Clara sat on the bedroom floor in the angled light and looked at the seam in the chest's interior and felt the same feeling she always associated with something balanced on a precise and irreversible point. The feeling just before something falls. The feeling of a breath held 1 second longer than comfortable. She thought about what Renata had said, that she barely had room for it. That sentimental value was still value. She thought about what Daniel had said. Nothing. Directly. Because Daniel rarely addressed her directly anymore. But she could hear his voice in her head clearly enough, the tone of mild contempt that had accumulated over years of watching her make choices he considered insufficient. She thought about Patricia's careful appraisal of things as she moved through their grandmother's rooms, the way she lifted objects and turned them over looking for marks. She thought about Greg saying it was sweet, said with the same intonation one uses for children drawing pictures. She thought about her grandmother's hands, the way they moved when she folded things. She thought about what the old woman had said. Some things are meant to find the right person. Clara pressed her palms flat against the interior base of the chest again and pushed, not in the center this time, but in the corners, first one, then the other. Nothing. Then she pressed both corners simultaneously, both hands flat, steady pressure. There was a sound, soft and deliberate. Not a crack or a protest, but a click. The clean, intentional click of a mechanism releasing. The base of the chest shifted, very slightly. A millimeter, no more. But the movement was definite and unmistakable. The seam she had seen opened into a hairline gap along one long edge, and against the light she could see that what she had taken for a single piece of wood was in fact 2, one resting precisely on top of the other. A false bottom. Clara sat very still for a moment. The morning light held steady across the chest. Somewhere outside, a car passed and was gone, and the street resumed its ordinary quiet. Her heartbeat was audible to her, not racing, but deliberate and alert, as though her body had been paying attention all along and was now confirming what her hands had already found. She worked her fingernails carefully into the seam along the edge where the gap had opened. The wood was fitted precisely, the tolerance so fine that she needed both hands, pressing and pulling at once, before the false bottom rose, smoothly on a slight angle, the way a well-made drawer opens, without drama, without resistance, the way a thing opens when it was built with care and patience, and the intention of lasting. What was inside the space beneath was not what she expected. She had expected a letter, perhaps, a photograph, the ordinary contents of an old woman's hidden sentiment, all love notes or deeds or folded prayers. She had expected something personal and quiet and entirely beside the point of money. The space was shallow, 3 inches deep, perhaps 4, and it was not empty. Wrapped in a piece of dark velvet cloth, tied at the corners with cord so old it had stiffened to a rigid gray, There was something that caught the light when she moved the lid aside. A gleam, brief and cold, like the flicker of a star seen from the corner of the eye. She did not touch it yet. She sat back and breathed slowly, and looked at the thin rectangle of velvet lying in the cedar-scented hollow beneath the false floor of her grandmother's chest. And for a long moment, the world around her was very quiet. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the windowsill and was gone. Inside, the chest waited in the way old things wait, with infinite, unruffled patience, as though it had been waiting here for decades and could easily wait a little longer, and would, if asked, but preferred not to. Clara reached in. The velvet was dense and fine, old, but intact, the pile still soft in the protected center, though the edges had worn thin. She could feel, through the cloth, shapes, not one shape, but many. Small, hard, faceted things that shifted minutely as she lifted them, the faintest sound as they settled against each other, a sound like distant wind chimes, like fine crystal touched very gently in a drawer. She set the bundle on the bedroom floor and sat cross-legged before it, her hands in her lap, and looked at it for a long time before she untied the cord. The knot was old and tight, pulled hard some years ago and left there, and she worked at it carefully with her thumbnail until the cord loosened and fell away. The velvet corners folded back, one by one, revealing what was beneath. Later, she would try to find the words for the moment, and be unable to do so precisely. Would come close, but not all the way. Would circle around it in her memory, as one circles around something too bright to look at directly. What she saw was color first, before shape, before understanding. Deep red and blue and green and clear white, the particular fire of faceted stones when light moves across them, each surface throwing back its own small captured sun. A loose galaxy of gems spread across dark velvet on her bedroom floor, scattered like seeds from an opened hand. She sat for a very long time. Then she picked one up, carefully, between her thumb and forefinger, and held it toward the window. It was small, roughly the size of a large pea, deep red with the quality of internal light that she had seen before only in photographs and once in a museum case, a display of things kept behind glass and treated as though their proximity was dangerous. The color was not uniform but alive, moving as she turned it, darkening at the edges, brightening at the center, the facets throwing sharp, precise lines of pink and orange light onto the skin of her hand. She set it down. She picked up another, clear, diamond brilliant, catching the morning light and throwing a small prismatic fan onto the ceiling. Then a deep blue, the color of the sky at 6 in the evening in winter. Then green, the specific saturated green of deep water, or old glass, or things pulled up from darkness into air. They were loose stones, unset. Dozens of them, perhaps more, pooled in the velvet like something poured, like something gathered over a long time by careful and deliberate hands. Her grandmother's hands. Clara sat on the floor of her small apartment in the gray March light, with a fortune she could not yet measure spread on a piece of velvet before her, and thought about all the things she did not know and all the things she had yet to understand, and she did not move for a long time. The chest stood open behind her, its false bottom lifted, the cedar smell drifting through the room, the old iron hinges holding the lid steady, the faint carved flowers along the edge catching the light the way they always had. Patient. Waiting. Done with the long work of keeping it secret, now content at last to let the right person hold what had been held inside. Clara reached forward and pressed her palm flat over the stones, not gripping, not claiming, just touching, just feeling the cool, faceted edges against her skin, the hard, specific weight of each small thing. And she breathed once, carefully, and the world outside continued in its ordinary way, entirely unaware that 3 flights above a street in a city that had never noticed her, everything had already changed. She needed to be careful. She knew that with a clarity that arrived before thought, before planning, before any of the practical considerations that would necessarily follow. She had spent her life being careful with things that could break, with money that had to stretch, with the feelings of a child she was raising alone, with the fragile mechanics of a life held together by precision and restraint. She would be careful with this. She gathered the stones back into the velvet slowly, counting as she went. She lost count twice and started again. When she had finished, she tied the cord around the bundle, not as tightly as before, but firmly, and placed it back in the hidden space. She lowered the false bottom until the mechanism clicked softly back into place. She pressed the corners once to confirm it was set. It was. She placed the linens back inside, one by one, in the order she had removed them, smoothing each fold. She closed the lid. The chest looked exactly as it always had. The dark wood, the iron hinges, the carved flowers along the edge, the smell of cedar that had always meant her grandmother's house, her grandmother's hands, the particular warmth of being in a room where someone was glad you had arrived. Clara stood, her knees aching from the cold floor, and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea, and sat at the table, and looked at the wall, and thought, carefully, about what needed to happen next, and how, and in what order, and with what degree of caution. And she smoothed each thought twice, the way her grandmother had taught her, once for doubt and once for certainty, until the tea went cold in the cup, and the light outside shifted from gray to gold, and the sounds of the city continued in their ordinary way, unknowing and indifferent, while Clara Voss sat very still and understood for the first time in her life that she was not, and had perhaps never been, without resources, only without the knowledge of them. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed in the dark, with the chest against the wall 3 feet away, and thought about the weight she had felt when she first lifted it. That slight, stubborn heaviness. She had attributed it to the wood, to the density of old-growth timber cut and cured before the world became too impatient to wait for things to season properly. Now she understood the weight differently. The chest had been carrying something for a long time, something dense and small and enormously valuable, and it had done so without complaint or announcement, which struck her as an admirable quality in a piece of furniture, and not entirely unlike the woman who had kept it. She thought about her grandmother, and in the dark, the thoughts came in images rather than words, the particular way old memories do when you stop trying to arrange them. Magdalena at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup. Magdalena in the garden, kneeling between rows of beans, with a patience that Clara had always found slightly miraculous, that willingness to tend things that grew on their own schedule. Magdalena folding laundry with the television on low, the news of some distant crisis washing through the room, while her hands moved in their quiet, repetitive rhythm, smoothing, stacking, smoothing again. Had she known? Had her grandmother known what was in that chest? The question seemed absurd as soon as she asked it. Of course she had known. The mechanism that released the false bottom was not an accident of old wood or a trick of settling joints. It was designed, crafted, fitted by someone who understood exactly what they were building. And Magdalena Voss had kept that chest in the same corner of the same room for 40 years. She had taken it with her when she moved, twice, before she settled in Grantford for good. She had polished the wood herself. Clara had seen her do it. She had kept the key to the hasp, which Clara had never seen locked, on a small hook inside the wardrobe, which Clara had thought at the time was simply the organized habit of an organized woman. She had known. And she had kept the knowledge for a very long time, through 4 children and a husband's death, and 22 years of widowhood, and the slow unwinding of a body that had worked hard for 8 decades. She had carried this secret, and not spoken of it to anyone, as far as Clara could determine, or at least not to anyone who had acted on it. Why had she not spoken? For Clara turned this question over for a long time. She thought about the way her grandmother had moved through money, which was carefully, without drama, the way people move through water when they don't want to make waves. She had never seemed poor, but she had never seemed comfortable in the way that people with money are comfortable. That particular ease of those who know the fall is cushioned. She had made do. She had been generous with small things and never spoke of large ones. She had accepted the settlement of the estate without protest or negotiation, as though the furniture and the silver and the painting were sufficient accounting of a long life. Unless, Clara thought, they were. Unless the furniture and the silver and the painting were precisely what they appeared to be, the ordinary residue of an ordinary life, and the extraordinary thing, the real weight, had been meant to pass separately. Not through a will. Not through an attorney's reading and a family dinner, and Renata calculating the value of oak and Daniel's wife lifting the undersides of chairs. Differently. Quietly. The way her grandmother had always done the things that mattered most. Some things are meant to find the right person. Clara opened her eyes in the dark. The chest was a shape against the wall, barely visible. The window gave enough ambient light to suggest its outline, the straight edges, the faint gleam of the iron hinges. She looked at it for a long time. The city outside made its low, continuous sound, the sound of other lives proceeding in their ordinary directions, and Clara lay still in the dark and understood. Slowly. The full architecture of what had just happened to her. Her grandmother had given her the chest, knowing she would take it, knowing the others would not want it, knowing that only Clara, who had sat beside it on the floor and traced the carved flowers, and stayed when the others had already moved on to louder rooms, would carry it home and sit quietly with it and press her hands against the wood and pay the kind of attention that reveals what is hidden. She had been chosen, not as a prize, not as a favorite, though perhaps she was that too, but as the right instrument for a specific task, the person whose hands would be steady, whose patience was genuine, whose grief was of the kind that sits close to the thing it mourns rather than stepping back to assess its value. The thought did not make her feel grand. It made her feel something more complicated than that, a mix of love and sorrow and the specific vertigo of understanding something that you can never quite ununderstand, that is lodged now permanently in your knowing of the world and changes the shape of everything you remember. She fell asleep near 3 a.m, with the chest still against the wall and the stones locked in their cedar-scented dark, patient and brilliant and hers, and dreamed of her grandmother's kitchen, the steam from the kettle, the particular quality of the light through the window in the early morning, and her grandmother's voice saying something that Clara could not quite hear but understood the shape of, the way you understand a sentence in a language you do not speak when the person saying it means it deeply enough. By Sunday morning, and she had decided 2 things with absolute clarity. The first was that she would tell no one until she understood what she had, the real nature of it, the honest breadth of it, measured by someone who knew. The second was that she would do this carefully, in the right order, without haste, and without the kind of fear that makes people act quickly when patience is what the moment requires. She had been patient for a long time. She could be patient a little longer. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table while Lily slept, and the morning gathered itself outside the window. She thought about who she might call, who she might trust, how one proceeds when one finds something that should not be real and is. The stones were real. She had held them in her hands. She had seen the light move through them. They were real, and they were hers, and they were in a velvet bundle in a cedar-scented dark beneath a floor that no one knew was there. She would begin Monday. She would make calls. She would be careful and methodical, and she would not, under any circumstances, tell Renata or Daniel or Greg or Patricia or anyone connected to any of them. Not yet. Not until she was standing on ground, solid enough to hold her weight without shifting. She drank her coffee. Outside, the Sunday light came in at a low angle, the particular gold of early March when the winter is not quite done, but has begun, at least, to pretend. It caught the brass of the chest's hinges through the open bedroom door, and threw a small, still gleam across the hallway floor. Clara watched it for a long time. Then she reached for her phone and opened a new note and wrote, at the top, a single sentence, and stared at it, and understood that what came next would not be simple, but would be hers, completely and quietly hers, for the first time in a long time. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the chest held its light. Monday came with a low sky and the smell of rain that had not yet decided to fall. Clara dropped Lily at school, drove to the diner, worked the morning shift with the mechanical competence that had always carried her through the hours when her mind was elsewhere, refilling cups and calling out orders and smiling at the regulars with the practiced warmth she had learned to separate entirely from whatever was happening inside her. She had gotten very good at that separation over the years. It was a skill no one taught you and no one complimented you on, but it kept things running. Between the breakfast rush and the lunch crowd, she stood at the back counter with her phone and searched quietly, carefully, using words she had never had occasion to use before. Gemologist, certified appraiser, loose stones, independent valuation. She read the small, careful language of professional assessments, the difference between a dealer and an appraiser, the importance of working with someone who had no financial stake in the outcome, someone whose job was to know, not to buy. She read about certifications, about the GIA, the Gemological Institute, about the reports that documented color and cut and clarity and carat weight in the precise language that turned a stone from a beautiful thing into a provable thing, a thing that existed on paper in the real world with a number attached to it. She wrote 3 names in her phone notes. Not dealers, appraisers, independent, certified, with offices in the city. That evening, after Lily had done her homework and eaten and gone to bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table and made the calls. 2 went to voicemail. The 3rd was answered by a woman with a brisk, professional voice who identified herself as the administrative coordinator for a firm called Meridian Gemological Services. Clara explained, carefully, that she had recently inherited some loose stones from a family member and wanted an independent appraisal before taking any further steps. The woman asked several standard questions. How many stones, roughly? Clara said she wasn't certain, perhaps 30 or 40. What type, if she knew? Clara said she didn't, not precisely. Different colors, different sizes. Had she had them looked at before? No. Was she looking to sell? Not at this time. There was a pause that Clara had learned, over years of phone calls about money, to read correctly. It was not hesitation. It was recalibration. The coordinator told her they could see her Thursday afternoon if she was available. Clara said she was. She hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. The chest was in the bedroom, visible through the half-open door, the dark wood catching the hallway light. She looked at it the way she had begun to look at it since Saturday, with a particular attention, as though it were an entirely different object from the one she had known all her life, and also exactly the same one, which was, she supposed, the truth of it. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in their ordinary shapes. She worked. She walked Lily to school and picked her up. She bought groceries and paid the gas bill and fixed the wobbly leg on the kitchen chair with a wedge of cardboard, which had been working for 3 weeks now and showed no signs of failing. She did not open the chest again. She did not look at the stones. She was not ready to hold them again until she understood them, and she would not understand them until Thursday. She told no one. This was not difficult. There was no one to tell, not in the way she meant. She had friends, colleagues, a neighbor named Sasha, who sometimes watched Lily in exchange for help with grocery runs, but no one who occupied the particular chamber of trust that this required. She had learned, somewhere in the accumulation of her adult years, that the people you could tell everything to were rare, perhaps 1 or 2 in a lifetime if you were lucky, and that her grandmother had been one of them, and that her grandmother was gone now, which left a specific kind of silence in the architecture of her daily life. She missed her. She missed her in the constant, low-frequency way that grief settles after the first violence of it passes. Not debilitating, not theatrical, but present, always present. A companion that walked quietly beside her through the ordinary hours. On Wednesday evening, after Lily was asleep, she opened the chest again. She did not touch the false bottom this time. She sat on the floor beside it and pressed her back against the bed frame and looked at the dark wood interior and the folded linens and breathed the cedar smell and thought about her grandmother keeping this for decades. The patience of that. The weight of knowing something for 40 years and choosing, again and again, not to speak. She thought of the family she had watched move through Magdalena's house, calculating and efficient, the dining set and the silver and the painting and the jewelry divided with the fluency of people who spoke money as a first language. She thought of Renata's voice saying the chest could be valuable, better have it appraised, the automatic reflex of someone for whom the value of a thing was its primary attribute. She thought of Daniel, who had never once asked her, in all the years since their father died and their mother moved away, and Clara had raised Lily alone, whether she was managing? Not once. Not in the careful way that means you genuinely want to know. Not in the uncomfortable way that means you feel you should ask. Not in any way at all. She was not angry. She had thought, so lying awake on the Saturday night of the discovery, that she might be angry at some point, and she had been prepared for that, had kept a space clear for it the way you keep a space clear for a guest you know is coming. But the anger had not arrived. What had arrived instead was something closer to clarity, a fine, quiet, surprisingly peaceful clarity, the feeling of seeing a landscape fully for the first time after a long period of poor light. She knew who she was. She had always known, though the knowing had been intermittent, obscured by exhaustion and worry, and the accumulated weight of making everything work on the margins of enough. But she had always known, underneath it, that she was her grandmother's kind of person, the kind who sat on the floor and traced the carved flowers, the kind who pressed their palms flat and paid attention, the kind who stayed. Some things are meant to find the right person. She closed the chest and went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. Thursday was overcast and still, the kind of day that feels like a held breath. She arranged for Sasha to pick up Lily from school, something she did occasionally when shifts ran long, and drove across the city to the address she had written down, a 12-story building in a professional district where the lobbies were marble and the elevators were quiet, and the floors were carpeted in colors that said money without requiring it to announce itself. Meridian Gemological Services occupied Suite 804. The waiting area was spare and well lit, with the particular quality of light that Clara recognized as deliberate, not ambient, but designed. The kind of lighting that illuminated without flattering, the kind used when the truth of an object was more important than its presentation. She had brought the velvet bundle in a zippered inner pocket of her coat, where it sat against her ribs, and she was acutely aware of it throughout the elevator ride, in a way that she supposed was not unlike what it felt like to carry something precious and fragile, which was exactly what it was. The appraiser was a man named Alderman, 50s, with a compact, precise quality about him, the look of someone who spent their professional life in close attention to small things. He wore magnifying glasses on a cord around his neck and had the clean, unhurried manner of someone who had never needed to rush because they had organized their life so that rushing was unnecessary. He shook her hand with a brief, dry grip and led her to a table in a room behind the reception area, a clean room with neutral walls and 2 specialized lamps positioned at angles over a white examination surface. She took the velvet bundle from her coat and placed it on the table. He looked at it without touching it for a moment. "Loose stones," he said, not a question. "Yes," she said. "May I?" He gestured toward the bundle. She nodded. He untied the cord with practiced hands, the same careful way she had untied it on Saturday, though his took half the time. The velvet fell open, and the stones lay on the white surface in the precise light of the examination lamps, and the room changed. Clara saw it in his face first, the quick, under-controlled adjustment of a professional who has trained himself not to react visibly and is now exercising that training deliberately, the faint flattening of expression that is itself an expression. He picked up a loupe from the table and leaned over the first stone, the deep red one she had noticed first, and was silent for approximately 45 seconds. When he straightened, he looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "How did you come by these?" he asked. She told him. She had inherited a linen chest from her grandmother. The chest had a false bottom. Inside the false bottom, she had found the bundle. She had not known they were there. She had not known the false bottom existed until 4 days ago. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you know anything about their history? Where your grandmother acquired them?" Clara said she did not. He picked up the red stone again and turned it under the lamp. "This is a Burmese ruby," he said, in the measured tone of someone choosing their words the way a carpenter chooses wood, for grain and strength and fitness of purpose. Old cut, which suggests it was faceted before modern standardization, probably mid-20th century, possibly earlier. The color is what is called pigeon's blood, which is the most prized grade in rubies. He set it down and picked up the deep blue stone. "This appears to be a cashmere sapphire." He paused. "If that's what it is, and the clarity and color suggest it is extremely rare. Cashmere stopped producing significant stones of this quality several decades ago." He moved through the stones methodically, picking each one up, examining it under the loupe, setting it down again, occasionally making a brief note on the pad beside him. Clara sat across the table and watched, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had found language insufficient since Saturday morning, and saw no reason to improve on that. After perhaps 20 minutes, he set down the last stone and looked at her across the table. "I'll need to conduct a thorough assessment before I can give you numbers," he said. "That will require several days. I'll need to weigh each stone precisely, document the cut and clarity grades, cross-reference against current market comparables, and in the case of several of these, confirm origin with additional testing. The origin determination matters significantly for value." He paused. "But I can tell you informally now what I'm looking at." "Please," Clara said. He leaned back slightly. "What you've brought me is a collection of colored gemstones, predominantly corundum, which is the family that includes rubies and sapphires, with several diamonds, and what I believe to be 2 Colombian emeralds, all of significant quality. Several are of exceptional quality, specifically the Burmese ruby and the Kashmir sapphire, which are among the rarest and most valuable stones in existence." He looked at the bundle on the table. Collections like this don't accumulate casually. These were gathered deliberately by someone with knowledge over time. The range of origins suggests they came through the trade over a period of years, not as a single purchase. Clara thought about her grandmother's quiet hands, the way she had kept things. "So what is your initial estimate," she said, "of the value?" He looked at her directly. "That's not something I'm able to give you accurately today, but I can tell you that you should not be discussing this with anyone until you have the official documentation in hand, because the number, when we arrive at it precisely, will make it very important that you proceed carefully." He paused. "What I'm seeing, at a preliminary glance, suggests a figure that would be substantially life-changing. I want to be measured in how I say that, because I've been wrong before, and precision is what my clients pay for. But I don't want you to leave here without understanding the approximate magnitude of what you've found." Clara sat with this for a moment. "Can you give me a range?" she said. "Even a rough one." He considered for a moment, then said a number. Clara nodded once, as though she had been told something she already knew, though she had not. The number was not what she had imagined. It was substantially larger. It was, in fact, a number that required a moment to locate correctly in her understanding of what numbers meant, the way a word in a foreign language requires a moment before the translation arrives. She thanked him. She asked about next steps. He explained the process, the formal assessment over 3 to 5 working days, the written report with provenance documentation where possible, the recommendations regarding insurance and storage in the interim. He asked if she had somewhere secure to keep the stones. She said she did, which was not entirely true, but she had driven across the city with them against her ribs, and she was not prepared to leave them anywhere she could not see them. He gave her the name of a bonded courier service and suggested, gently, that she consider it. She said she would look into it. When she left the building, the city was doing its Thursday afternoon business around her, people moving in and out of lobbies, taxis cutting across intersections, a woman walking a large dog that strained against its leash toward a food cart. Ordinary life, ordinary Thursday. Clara walked to her car in the parking structure and sat inside it for a long time without starting the engine. The velvet bundle was back in the inner pocket of her coat. She could feel it against her ribs. She put her hand flat over it from the outside, through the fabric of the coat, feeling the faint irregular shapes beneath the velvet beneath the cloth, and sat in the concrete dark of the parking structure and breathed slowly and carefully, and thought about her grandmother. The number Alderman had said was approximately $298 million. He had said approximately. He had said it was preliminary. He had said precision was what his clients paid for, and he had not arrived at precision yet. But the range he had given was narrow enough, between 280 and 315 million, that the word approximately was doing less work than it might have in other circumstances. Clara pressed her hand over the stones and breathed. She thought about the chest, about its impossible ordinary presence in her grandmother's bedroom for 40 years, patient and unremarkable, holding sheets and pillowcases and the smell of cedar. She thought about the carved flowers along the edge, which she had traced as a child. She thought about the millions of moments in which this object had simply been furniture, a box, the thing that held the good linen, while inside it, in the dark beneath the false floor, in the velvet bundle tied with cord that had stiffened to gray with age. An unimaginable fortune lay folded in cedar-scented silence. She thought about Renata saying, "The chest could be valuable. Better have it appraised." She thought about Patricia moving through the upstairs rooms with her practiced inventory, lifting the undersides of chairs. She thought about Greg saying it was sweet and laughing. She did not feel vindicated yet. She was not at that point in the story. She was at the point where the understanding was still arriving in waves, each wave carrying something new. She would be at the other point eventually, but for now she was simply here, in a parking structure, with her hand over $300 million and her grandmother's voice somewhere at the edge of her hearing. Not words, but a tone. The tone that Magdalena used when she was satisfied, when she had done the thing she set out to do. Clara started the engine and drove home. The formal appraisal report arrived in 8 days, not 5, because Alderman had sent 2 of the stones to a partner laboratory for origin confirmation, the ruby and the sapphire, the 2 he had most needed to verify. When the report arrived by secure courier, Clara signed for it at the door of her apartment while Lily was at school and opened it at the kitchen table with the same deliberate care she brought to things that mattered. It was 22 pages, dense with technical language, with measurements and grades and charts comparing the color profiles of each stone against the established scales. She read it slowly, twice, understanding roughly half and inferring much of the rest from context. At the back was the summary page, which was formatted differently from the rest, cleaner, with a layout that prioritized legibility over density. The total assessed value of the collection, the report stated, was $298 million at current wholesale market rates, with individual retail values potentially exceeding $340 million, depending on how the collection was brought to market, whether as a whole or in separate lots. The Burmese ruby alone, a stone of 7.4 carats, with a GIA-verified pigeon's blood designation and Mogok Valley origin, was valued at approximately $41 million. The Kashmir sapphire, 9.2 carats, with a rare laboratory confirmation of Kashmir provenance from a period of peak production, was assessed at $63 million. The remaining stones, including 11 diamonds of various cuts, ranging from 2.1 to 4.8 carats, 16 additional rubies, and sapphires of varying origins and grades, and 2 Colombian emeralds of notable clarity, accounted for the balance. 42 stones in total. Clara had counted 37 the first time, because she had lost count twice, and several of the smaller stones had settled beneath the others in the velvet. 42. She sat with the report in her hands and looked at the summary page for a long time. $298 million. The number existed now in official language, on certified paper, with stamps and reference numbers and the signature of a credentialed professional. It was real in a way that her private knowledge of it hadn't quite been. The way something is real when it can be proved, when it exists in the world, and not only in the knowledge of one person sitting alone in a kitchen on a gray morning. She folded the report and placed it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the drawer of her bedside table. In the back, beneath a folder of Lily's old school reports and a warranty card for the vacuum cleaner. She locked the bedside drawer, something she had never had occasion to do before, and put the key in her coat pocket. Then she sat down and thought about what came next. She needed a lawyer. That was first and clearest. Not the family attorney who had read the will in the dry, pipe tobacco-scented voice of old Harwick, who had known her grandmother, and who would be professionally required to treat her with the same neutrality he had extended to Renata and Daniel. A different lawyer, her own. Someone whose entire professional obligation was to her interests and no one else's. She needed to understand the legal situation. Were the stones unambiguously hers? The chest had been given to her by the terms of the estate, and she had taken it with the full knowledge and agreement of the family. The chest was hers. The contents of the chest were the contents of the chest. But she knew that the law was not always as simple as the logic of its sentences, and she needed someone who knew the difference and could navigate it. She needed to understand the tax situation. She did not know much about inheritance tax and capital gains, and the precise mechanisms by which the government would eventually want its share of a fortune discovered in a false-bottom chest, but she knew these mechanisms existed and that they required careful handling by people who understood them, not by someone who had learned to think about money primarily in terms of what was due on the 15th of the month. She needed to be careful. She spent the afternoon of the day the report arrived, making calls with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to the gemologist search. She asked 3 people she knew peripherally: a colleague at the cleaning service who had once mentioned a property dispute, a woman from Lily's school whose husband was in finance, a neighbor who had been through a divorce she described as legally complicated, whether they had ever used an estate attorney, and what their experience had been. She was careful about how she phrased her questions. She said she was dealing with an inheritance matter that had some complexity to it. She did not say more. By evening, she had 2 names. She chose the one that appeared in both lists, a woman named Soto, who had a firm in the professional district and whose reviews mentioned, more than once, that she was thorough and direct and did not waste time or money. She called the next morning, before the diner shift, and made an appointment for the following Monday. A consultation, she said, an estate matter with some complexity. The coordinator asked if she could describe the complexity in broad terms so they could allocate the appropriate time. Clara said she had inherited a collection of gemstones with an assessed value of approximately $300 million from her late grandmother and needed to understand her legal position. There was a pause. Then the coordinator said that Monday at 2 o'clock would be perfect, and that Ms. Soto would clear the afternoon. On Saturday afternoon, 2 weeks after she had first pressed her palms flat against the interior base of the chest, Clara drove across town to a facility aldermen had recommended, a bonded private vault with temperature and humidity controls and round-the-clock security, the kind of place where the things stored inside were insured individually and never left unattended. She brought the velvet bundle in the same inner pocket of the same coat and signed the intake forms at the reception desk with the same deliberate care she brought to everything now, reading each line before she signed it, which she had always done with important documents, but which felt different now, felt essential in a new way, felt like the difference between caution and wisdom. She handed the bundle to the intake officer and watched it placed into a sealed evidence bag and tagged and recorded and taken through the secured door. She was given a receipt and a client number and a card with a security code on it. She put the card in the same pocket where the vault key card would live. She thanked the officer and walked out into the afternoon air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. For the first time since she had opened the false bottom of the chest, the stones were not within reach. The coat pocket against her ribs was empty, and the feeling was odd. Not loss exactly, but absence. The particular absence of something that had been part of your physical awareness for 2 weeks and was now elsewhere. She thought about her grandmother keeping them for 40 years. The weight of that. The daily, unremarkable weight of an extraordinary thing folded into the texture of an ordinary life. She walked back to her car. She had things to do. She had a shift tomorrow morning. She had a consultation on Monday. She had a daughter who needed help with a book report on mountain ecosystems that was due Wednesday, and who had been putting it off in the particular, confident way of children who trust their mothers to help them at the last minute. She drove home through the Saturday traffic, ordinary and unhurried, and thought about Monday with the kind of clear, forward attention she had not been able to direct at the future for a very long time. The future had always been a place she approached carefully, with limited expectations, because expectations in limited circumstances are a kind of cruelty you impose on yourself. But Monday was different. Monday she would sit across a desk from a woman whose job was to protect her interests, and she would lay out the facts, and she would begin to understand the shape of what was possible. That was enough. That was, for now, exactly enough. The Monday consultation lasted 3 hours. Elena Soto was a compact, direct woman in her mid-40s, with the particular quality of attention that comes from years of sitting across tables, from people who are either trying to deceive her or trying to protect something that frightens them, and an ability to tell the difference quickly. She listened to Clara's account of the discovery without interrupting, and Clara told it in the order it had happened: the death, the estate, the chest, the siblings, the false bottom, the stones, the appraisal report, which she had brought in the envelope and placed on the desk before she began. When Clara finished, Soto read the report summary once through, briefly, and set it down. The chest was assigned to you by mutual agreement of all parties at the estate, she said. Yes. Witnessed and agreed in the presence of the estate attorney. Yes. And there was no inventory of the chest's contents taken prior to that agreement, by the estate attorney or by any other party. Not that I'm aware of. Soto nodded slowly. Then the contents belong to you. The chest is legally yours. It was transferred to you by the estate, and whatever is inside it transfers with it. There is no legal mechanism by which the contents of a personal item transferred at estate settlement can be reclaimed by other beneficiaries, absent fraud, and there is no fraud here. You didn't conceal the false bottom from anyone. You didn't know it existed. She paused. Did you? No, Clara said. Then there's no question of good faith. The only questions are tax and provenance. She folded her hands. On the tax side, the assessment establishes fair market value at the date you came into possession, which will establish the basis for any future capital gains if you sell. There will also be the question of whether the gems constitute an inheritance, which carries its own treatment, or a discovery of property, which is different. I'll need to look at the specific language of the estate documents before I can advise you precisely on that. On provenance, do you have any knowledge of how your grandmother came by these? No, Clara said. None. That's not unusual in estates of this type. We'll conduct a provenance investigation, which is standard practice before any asset of this value is moved through legitimate channels. It will involve research into your grandmother's history, travel records if available, any documentation in the estate, and in some cases, direct contact with international gem dealers to see if the collection can be traced. It will take time and it will cost something, but it's necessary to protect you. She looked at Clara directly. If the provenance is clean, which I have no reason to assume it isn't, you are looking at one of the most significant personal inheritances I have encountered in 20 years of estate practice. Clara looked at her steadily. And if it's not clean? Soto returned the look with equal steadiness. Then we deal with whatever it is. But we deal with it from a position of full transparency and good faith, which is the strongest position available. She picked up her pen. I want to emphasize something. You are currently in an excellent position legally. You discovered these stones through normal, transparent means. You had them professionally appraised immediately. You consulted legal counsel within weeks of the discovery. Every decision you've made so far has been correct. The only thing that can complicate your position going forward is if you make decisions in haste or in secret. I assume that's not what you're here for. No, Clara said. It isn't. Good. Soto opened a new file and began writing. Then let's start at the beginning. The provenance investigation took 6 weeks. Clara knew this was fast only in the context of how long it might have taken. In the context of her ordinary life, 6 weeks was a long time, long enough to work 120 diner shifts, long enough for Lily to finish one term and begin another, long enough for the heating vent in the hallway to start making its sound again, and for Clara to fix it herself this time with a piece of foam weather stripping she had watched a video about online, which worked and which cost $4. She told no one about the stones during those 6 weeks. Not Sasha, not her colleague from the cleaning service, not the woman from Lily's school. She lived her life in exactly the shape it had always had. The early mornings, and the long shifts, and the grocery runs, and the help with homework. The deliberate, calibrated management of a life operating on the margins. For the only difference was that she now had an attorney and a client number at a bonded vault and an envelope in the drawer of her bedside table, which she opened sometimes in the evenings when Lily was asleep to look at the summary page. The number was always the same. It was reliably, patiently the same. On a Friday morning in late April, Soto called to tell her the investigation was complete. The stones were clean. Their provenance, traced through documentation found in a safe deposit box that had belonged to Magdalena's late husband Clara Voss, and which Clara had not previously known existed, led back to a collection assembled by Clara Voss between 1962 and 1988, during his years working as a procurement specialist for a European gem trading company. Otto had acquired the stones legitimately through the company. He had declared them on import records and had paid the applicable duties. The records were meticulous, as the records of someone who knew they were building something they intended to pass on tend to be. Otto Voss had been dead for 22 years. He had not, apparently, told his children about the collection. He had told his wife. Clara sat in her kitchen and looked at the wall and thought about her grandmother knowing this for 22 years. Alone with it for 22 years. Keeping it quiet and patient in the dark, cedar-scented interior of the chest. Through 4 children and their marriages and their divorces and their various calculations of the value of things, waiting for the right person. Some things take a while, but they find them. She pressed her palms flat on the kitchen table, once for doubt and once for certainty, the way her grandmother had taught her, and when she lifted them, the table was solid under her hands, and the morning light was coming through the window, and outside the city was doing its ordinary business, and inside the drawer of the bedside table was the report that said $298 million. And Clara Voss looked at the morning light and understood that she was ready for what came next. The decision of how to bring the collection to market took another 3 weeks of consultation. Soto brought in a specialist, a woman named Price, who worked for an international auction house and had spent her career moving significant gemstone collections through legitimate channels, navigating the intersection of legal documentation, market timing, and the particular demands of buyers at the level where numbers like these were transacted. She was tall and unhurried and spoke about the stones with a reverence that Clara found both professional and entirely genuine. The reverence of someone who has spent a life in proximity to beautiful things and has not become bored by them. Price recommended a staged approach. The anchor stones, the Burmese ruby and the Kashmir sapphire, were best brought to auction where serious international collectors and institutional buyers could be reached, where competition would drive prices to their natural ceiling. The remaining stones could be offered in a secondary sale, either at the same house or through a specialist dealer, depending on market timing. She talked about the auction houses that handled stones at this level, the process of authentication certificates, the catalog descriptions, the preview exhibitions where buyers would examine the pieces under controlled conditions. She talked about the timeline, 8 months to a year from the point of consignment to the point of cleared payment. 8 months to a year. Clara thought about 8 months ago when she had been standing at the back counter of the diner, reading the insurance bill that had arrived unexpectedly, and calculating which payment she could push by 2 weeks without consequences. She thought about 8 months forward, what that calendar looked like from here. She said yes to the staged approach. She signed the consignment agreement on the 23rd of May on a clean table in Soto's office, with Price and the attorney present and the ink drying in the afternoon light. When she left the building, she stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city moved around her as it always had. A bus hissed to a stop across the street. Someone was eating a sandwich on the steps of the building next door. A pigeon landed on the curb with the particular confidence of city pigeons and looked at Clara as though it had been expecting her. She pulled out her phone and called the diner. She told them she was giving 2 weeks' notice. Her hands were steady on the phone. Her voice was steady. She thanked the manager, who had been decent to her for 3 years and deserved the courtesy of a decent goodbye. She hung up and stood for a moment longer on the sidewalk. Then she called the cleaning service and told them the same thing. Then she called the number for a different school, the one she had looked at twice and turned away from because the distance and the tuition had made the conversation feel like cruelty. She asked about the application process for the fall term. The woman on the phone said the deadline for fall was June 15th and asked Lily's current grade level. Clara said 3rd grade. The woman said they had spaces and would she like to come in. Clara said yes. She walked back to her car in the afternoon light, the same light that had always been here, the same city, the same pigeon that was now surveying someone else's portion of sidewalk with equal interest. And she felt the particular kind of lightness that is not the absence of weight, but its redistribution. The feeling of setting down something you have been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing you were carrying it. She drove home and made dinner. Lily sat at the kitchen table and talked about her day, the book report that had turned out fine, a disagreement with a classmate that had resolved itself by lunch, a dream she'd had the night before about a dog that could fly. Clara listened and asked questions, and served the food, and cleared the plates, and sat with her daughter while she finished her homework. And when Lily asked why she was smiling, Clara said she was just having a good day. Lily accepted this with the same equanimity she accepted most things. She nodded and returned to her homework, and Clara looked at her for a moment. This child she had been raising alone in a 3rd-floor apartment on a careful budget, and this child who had grown up with a mother who smoothed creases twice and paid bills in a calibrated order and smiled at strangers in diners and fixed wobbly chair legs with folded cardboard, and thought about what it meant that all of this was about to change. Not the smiling, not the careful attention, not the folding twice. Those were not products of difficulty. They were simply who Clara was, who her grandmother had been, what passed between them in the particular inheritance of character that no false bottom is needed to hold. But the rest of it, the margins, the calibration, the constant exhausting arithmetic of just enough, that was about to end. She put Lily to bed that night and sat in the kitchen and wrote a letter she had been composing in pieces for 3 weeks, since the provenance results had come in and she had understood with full clarity what she was about to inherit. She wrote it by hand, on paper, because some things should not live only on screens. It was not a long letter. She was not a person who required many words for the things that mattered most. It was addressed to no one in particular. It began, "There are things in this world that look like nothing." She stopped there and looked at what she had written. The lamp above the kitchen table cast a steady, warm circle over the paper. Outside, the city was settling into its late-night rhythms, quieter, slower, the sounds of a place that had been working all day and was beginning at last to rest. The chest was in the bedroom, dark wood and iron hinges, the carved flowers she knew by touch, to the cedar smell that was her grandmother and the particular warmth of being in a room where someone was glad you had arrived. She picked up the pen again and wrote the rest of what she needed to say. It did not take long. The truest things never do. The auction was held on a Thursday evening in October, in a room in the city that Clara had passed 100 times without ever going inside. It was the kind of building that communicated its purpose through architecture rather than signage, the kind of place that assumed you already knew what it was and what it required of you to enter. High ceilings, a facade of pale stone, the kind of quiet at the door that was not emptiness, but the organized absence of unnecessary noise. She had been inside once before, for the preview exhibition 2 weeks earlier, when the stones had been displayed in individual lit cases with catalog descriptions printed on small white cards in very small type, and she had walked through the room slowly with Price beside her, and looked at the ruby and the sapphire and the others through the glass, and felt the strange, doubled experience of recognizing something intimate in a public setting, the way you feel when you see a private photograph reproduced somewhere official. She had not told Renata or Daniel about the auction. She had not told anyone in the family. Soto had advised her that she was under no legal obligation to disclose the existence of the collection to the other beneficiaries, that the estate had been settled, the inheritance finalized, and what Clara had found in the chest she had taken with full agreement was hers entirely and categorically. The attorney had said this in her characteristic direct way, without embellishment, and Clara had sat with it for a few days before she was satisfied that she agreed. She agreed. The chest had been left to her, not the contents, individually inventoried and appraised and assigned as lines in a document. The chest, the whole of it, the weight and the smell and the dark wood and the iron hinges and the carved flowers and whatever it contained, which was everything, which was the whole secret weight of her grandmother's life and her grandfather's careful decades of building something for someone who would know what it was for. They had given her the chest the way you hand someone a plain envelope that holds a letter you have been waiting to deliver for 40 years. You have to give them the whole envelope, and you cannot separate the letter from the paper it is folded in and distribute the pieces to different hands. She had not told Renata or Daniel, but she had not, in those months since the discovery, been able to stop thinking about the moment when they would find out. Not with anticipation exactly. Not with the hot, gratifying anger of someone who has been waiting to prove a point. It was quieter than that. More complex. The way you think about a thing you know is coming and cannot avoid, and are not entirely sure how you want to feel about when it arrives. The auction results were published. That was the nature of public sales at this level. The results were a matter of record, available to anyone who looked. The hammer price of the Burmese ruby, the hammer price of the Kashmir sapphire, the figures that would move through the trade press and the financial news, and eventually, because these were the kind of numbers that traveled, through the more ordinary channels of people who forwarded articles and said, "Did you see this?" and left the link for someone else to find. She supposed they would see it. She supposed it was a matter of when, not whether. She sat in the auction room, in a chair that was more comfortable than she had expected, and watched the auctioneer move through the catalog with the precise, rhythmic efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. And she felt, for most of the evening, a kind of calm that she recognized from other moments in her life, when the thing she had been waiting for was finally, irrevocably happening, and there was nothing left to do but be present to it. The ruby went first. The bidding opened at 22 million and moved upward, with the particular quality of significant money being committed, not in the quick, nervous increments of smaller amounts, but in the steady, deliberate steps of buyers who knew exactly what they were doing and why. At 38 million, the field narrowed to 2. At 41, one paddle went down. The hammer fell at 43.5 million. Clara looked at her hands in her lap. The sapphire came later in the evening. It opened at 30 million and climbed with similar deliberateness to a hammer price of 68 million. There was a brief, contained sound in the room at that number. Not applause exactly, but the audible recognition of a significant thing. The sound a room makes when something notable has just been confirmed. By the end of the evening, the first portion of the collection had realized a combined hammer price of $162 million. The secondary sale, scheduled for February, would bring the balance. Price met her afterward with the controlled satisfaction of someone for whom professional success and genuine pleasure were not mutually exclusive. She said the results were strong. She said the ruby had exceeded their estimate by 2.5 million and the sapphire by 5. She said the secondary sale, given the momentum of the first, would likely perform at the higher end of projections. Clara thanked her and shook her hand and went home. Lily was asleep. Sasha, who had been watching her, was reading on the couch and looked up with the easy familiarity of someone who had known Clara long enough to not require an explanation for unusual evenings. Clara sat down beside her, and Sasha said quietly, "How did it go?" And Clara said it went well, and Sasha looked at her with the particular perception of someone who can read the shape of a sentence even when the content is minimal, and said, "Okay," and patted her hand once and went back to her book, which was exactly the right response and exactly why Sasha was one of the 2 or 3 people in Clara's life whose company felt like rest rather than effort. When Sasha left and the apartment was quiet, Clara went to the bedroom and opened the drawer and took out the envelope with the appraisal report. She had stopped needing to read it months ago. She knew the numbers by heart, had known them since the second reading on the first day. But she held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the paper, and then put it back. The chest was still there, against the wall by the window, where it had always stood. Empty now of the linens, which she had washed and put in her own closet. Empty of the velvet bundle, which was gone to buyers in rooms she would never see. Empty of everything except the cedar smell, which was stubborn, which lingered with the same quiet persistence that had characterized everything about this particular piece of furniture and the woman who had kept it. She pressed her palm flat against the lid. The wood was smooth under her hand, worn to the quality of something that had been touched for decades by careful hands. She pressed once and held it, and thought about her grandmother, who had done this same thing, stood in this same proximity to this same object, while with the same knowledge of what it contained and the same patience about what it was for. She did not feel grateful in the way that gratitude is usually described, the warm, expansive surge of it. She felt something older and more precise than that. She felt known. The news reached Renata on a Monday in November, through a financial newsletter that her husband Greg received in his inbox, and forwarded to her with a single line of text above the link that said, "Is this grandmother's stuff?" which was both accurate and entirely characteristic of Greg. The article was brief. A notable autumn auction had seen strong results in the colored gemstone category, headlined by a Burmese ruby and a Kashmir sapphire from a private European collection, acquired as a single lot by a North American collector. The combined sale had contributed to what trade commentators were describing as a significant season for top-tier colored stones. The seller was identified only as a private estate. Renata read it twice and then called Daniel. Daniel had already seen it, which was not surprising. He had always been faster at finding things that disturbed him than things that didn't. He had not called Clara yet. He was waiting to be certain, he said, which meant he was waiting to understand the situation fully before he chose his posture. Renata said she was going to call Clara. Daniel said maybe wait. Renata said she wasn't waiting. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Clara was standing in the kitchen of the new house. The new house was the reason she had not answered calls she did not recognize for the past 2 months. There had been many calls from many directions in the period since the auction results had moved through trade publications and eventually, inevitably, into the broader current of information that finds its way to interested parties. The house was not large by the standards of the neighborhood, a quiet residential street 4 miles from the school Lily had started in September, with a garden in the back and a room for each of them, and a kitchen with a window that faced east and caught the morning light in a way that had made Clara stop in the doorway during the viewing and stand there for longer than was probably appropriate, feeling the light on her face, thinking about east-facing windows and the quality of mornings and what it meant that this was now something she could consider. When Renata's name appeared on the screen, Clara stood in the kitchen of the new house and looked at it for a moment. The morning light came through the window at the angle she had loved during the viewing. Outside, the garden was bare and November gray, but the soil was good, a gardener had told her when she asked, the kind that would take well to what you put in it. Come spring, she answered. Clara, Renata said, and her voice had its usual calibrated quality, the tone of someone choosing their words carefully, but at a speed that revealed the care. I saw something about an auction, gemstones from a private European collection. A pause. That was grandmother's, wasn't it? It was not a question. Quite. Yes, Clara said. A silence. The kind of silence that is not empty but full of things being rapidly rearranged. The chest, Renata said. So, yes. You found them in the chest. Yes. Another silence, longer this time. Why didn't you tell us? Renata said. The grammar of the sentence lacked its question mark, which told Clara something about the state Renata was in. Renata was precise about grammar when she was in control of a situation. When she wasn't, the precision slipped. Clara thought about how to answer this. She had thought about it many times over the previous months, because she had known the call was coming, and she had wanted to know what she believed before she was asked to defend it. She had arrived at something that was not a defense exactly, but a description. There was nothing to tell until I understood what I had, she said. And once I understood it, it was mine. Legally and completely. A false bottom, Renata said. And the 2 words carried something Clara could not fully name. A mix of disbelief and a retroactive recalculation of every moment in the estate settlement. Yes. And you knew? No, Clara said. I didn't. I found it when I went through the linens at home after I'd brought it back. But you had it appraised before you told any of us. I had it appraised to understand what it was. Yes. There was a long silence. Clara stood in the kitchen light and waited. She had learned, over years of conversations that required patience, to stop filling silences that were not hers to fill. How much? Renata said. The full collection will realize somewhere between 300 and 340 million, when the secondary sale completes in February. The silence that followed was of a different quality from the previous ones. Clara recognized it because she had sat in it herself, on the floor of her apartment bedroom, in the angled March light, holding a deep red stone between her thumb and forefinger. The silence of a number that requires time to locate correctly in the understanding of what numbers mean. $300 million, Renata said. Approximately. Another silence. Then, Clara. That should be shared. That should have been declared in the estate. It was part of grandmother's estate, and we're all beneficiaries. I've taken legal advice on this, Clara said, and her voice was steady, not cold, not triumphant, simply level in the way that things are level when they are standing on solid ground. The chest was assigned to me by the estate in its entirety, with the full agreement of all parties. The attorney who handled the estate was present, or what the chest contained transferred with it. There is no legal question here. There may be a moral one, Renata said. Clara thought about this. She had thought about it before, and she had arrived at her answer. Grandmother knew what was in the chest, she said. She knew for decades. She chose not to divide it as part of the estate. She chose to pass it through the chest, specifically to whoever took the chest. That was her decision. I'm honoring it. How convenient for you, Renata said. And now there was heat in the voice, the heat of someone who has lost an argument they had not expected to be in. That you happened to want the chest. I wanted it because it was hers, Clara said. The same reason I always sat on the floor next to it. The same reason I drove 4 hours to visit her when no one else was coming. The same reason I was there in October and November and December last year when she was fading, not because I knew what was inside it. A long silence. She chose me, Clara said, not unkindly. I think you knew that. I think you knew it at the estate, which is why no one fought me for the chest. Not because they thought it was worthless. Because they knew, at some level, that it was meant to be mine. Renata said nothing. I'm not angry at you, Clara said. I mean that. You're my sister, and whatever comes next, that doesn't change. But I'm not going to apologize for this, and I'm not going to divide it. It was grandmother's decision to leave it as she left it, and it was the right decision, and I'm going to respect it. The call ended shortly after. Not badly, but not warmly. The kind of ending that is a beginning of a different kind of relationship, one that would need to be rebuilt, slowly, with the acknowledgement of distance on both sides. Daniel called the following day. His version of the conversation was briefer and more controlled, and carried a tone that Clara recognized as his particular brand of diminishment. The suggestion that she had been cleverer than expected, which he framed as a compliment while meaning something else entirely. She thanked him and said she hoped they could have dinner sometime when things had settled. He said maybe in the spring. She said she would look forward to it. She was not sure she would look forward to it, but she thought she might, in time, manage it with grace, which was all she had ever managed her family with, and which seemed sufficient. Greg called once. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was cordial and ended with a suggestion that they might discuss the estate situation with a neutral party, which she understood to mean a lawyer other than her own, and in service of an outcome other than hers, and she did not call back. Patricia did not call at all. What surprised her in the weeks that followed the first auction was not the calls from the family. She had expected those, had prepared for them, had walked through them in her mind until she knew the shape of her own answers well enough to speak them steadily. What surprised her was everything else. The feeling of the new house settling around her, the specific quality of Lily's happiness, which was not the explosive happiness of a child given something spectacular, but the quieter, a more lasting happiness of a child who has more room, more stability, more of her mother's calm attention unclouded by the particular worry that had always been present before, even when Clara had been careful not to show it. Children felt it anyway. She had known that and tried not to let the worry through, and she had succeeded well enough, she thought. But she understood now what well enough had cost. The effort of containment, the daily work of translating exhaustion into steadiness, of keeping the worry behind her face, while her face presented something that would not frighten her daughter. She did not need to do that work anymore. The feeling of not needing to do it was its own discovery, one that arrived slowly, the way your eyes adjust to a room with more light in it, not all at once, but incrementally. Until you look around and realize you can see everything clearly, and you have simply, quietly, forgotten what the dimness felt like. Lily started the new school in September and came home on the third day and said, without preamble, that she had made 2 friends, and also that the library had a section specifically for books about animals, and could they go on Saturday. Clara said yes, and they went, and Lily checked out 4 books, and read 2 of them before Sunday afternoon, and started the 3rd before bed. Clara sat in the kitchen of the new house in the Saturday evening light and felt something so straightforward that she almost did not recognize it. She felt, simply, fine. Not in the diminished, resigned sense in which she had used that word for most of her adult life. Fine as in managing, fine as in not currently in crisis, fine as in the immediate disasters have been averted, and there is nothing to do tonight except wait for the next one. She felt fine in the original sense of the word, the one it had before years of use had hollowed it out. She felt well. She felt intact. She felt like someone standing on ground that would hold. She still worked. Not the diner, not the cleaning service, not the economy of hours calibrated precisely against the cost of everything. She had enrolled in a course at the community college, estate management and trust administration, practical and specific, and taught by a woman with 30 years in fiduciary practice who was the least romantic person Clara had ever liked. She was learning what she needed to know to manage what she had, which was what Soto had advised and what her grandmother's example had suggested, on the idea that the correct response to having something is to understand it. She gave to Sasha a specific, named gift, agreed upon between them with the directness that their friendship permitted, enough for Sasha to clear the debt that had been making her anxious for 2 years and take the training course she had been postponing because the timing was never right. Sasha said this was too much. Clara said it was what she wanted to give, and she hoped Sasha would take it. Sasha took it and cried briefly, and then was practical about it in the way that people are practical when they have been given something that changes the calculus of a problem they have been carrying. And that was the right response, and Clara was glad. She established a scholarship fund through the Community Foundation, directed at working mothers returning to education, administered by the foundation so that its giving would outlast any single decision of hers, would continue in its small, specific way long after she was no longer managing it personally. She funded it at a level that would support 8 to 10 women a year, indefinitely. She did not name it after herself. She named it after her grandmother. Magdalena Voss Scholarship for Perseverance, which was not the most elegant phrasing but was accurate, and accuracy seemed right. She thought about perseverance often in those months, about what it meant and what it cost and what it was made of in the specific texture of ordinary days. It was not, she understood now, simply the act of continuing. You could continue from fear, from inertia, from the absence of alternatives. Perseverance was something different, the act of continuing with belief intact, the maintenance of the internal certainty that the ground was there even when you could not feel it, that the light was coming even when the room was dim, that some things were worth the long patience of waiting for them to arrive. She had learned that from her grandmother. Not in any single lesson, not in any particular conversation, but in the long accumulation of the way the old woman moved through her days. The twice-smoothed fold, the twice-pressed crease, the quiet, unwavering attention to the things that deserved it. She understood now that the chest itself had been a lesson, not in wealth, not in fortune, not in the possibility of a hidden thing making everything better. The lesson was in the attention. The lesson was in sitting on the floor, in tracing the carved flowers, in pressing your palms flat and noticing what moved when it should not, in staying in the room after the louder voices had gone to assess the furniture. The lesson was in becoming the kind of person to whom the right things could be given. The secondary sale completed in February on a gray Wednesday, and Price called in the afternoon to confirm the final numbers. The total realized across both sales was $312 million before applicable fees and taxes. After all deductions, properly calculated and documented and filed through Soto's firm, with the scrupulous correctness that Clara had come to see as not merely advisable, but morally necessary. The net amount that settled into the trust accounts established for her and for Lily's future was $219 million. $219 million. She sat with this number in the way she sat with things that required sitting with. At the kitchen table, in the morning light from the east-facing window, with tea that was still warm this time because she had learned, or was learning, the quiet luxury of drinking something before it went cold. She had written in her notebook at the top of the page the number, and beneath it in her grandmother's phrase, for the category of things that mattered, worth the wait. She called Lily into the kitchen, where her daughter sat down with the particular fidgeting energy of a 10-year-old on a school morning, and looked at her mother with the clear, uncomplicated attention she always gave to things she found important. Clara told her, not the full number, which was a number too large for a 10-year-old's morning, but the fact of it, the shape of what had happened, the chest, the false bottom, her great-grandmother and great-grandfather, whose photographs she knew from the mantel at the Grantford house, the stones that had traveled through decades in the dark of a cedar-scented interior, waiting. She told it simply, as a story, because it was one, because it had the architecture of a real story, the struggle and the patience and the long hidden thing and the discovery and the change. Lily listened with her chin in her hands and her eyes on her mother's face, and when Clara finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Did Nana know we would find it?" "I think," Clara said, "that Nana knew I would find it." Lily considered this. "Because you're the one who always paid attention," she said, not as a question. Clara looked at her daughter. This child who had grown up watching her mother smooth creases twice, and fix things with what was available, and drive 4 hours to visit a woman who walked slowly and made tea and told stories without morals. This child who had asked, on the drive to the funeral, whether her great-grandmother had been afraid, and accepted the answer that she was ready as sufficient because she understood already the difference between the two. "Yes," Clara said, "because I paid attention." Lily nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already understood. Then she asked if she could have cereal, and whether they were still going to see the botanical garden on Saturday, because she had read about the tropical section, and there were apparently plants in there that had evolved specifically to be carnivorous, which she felt strongly that she needed to see. Clara said yes to both. She drove Lily to school that morning in the gray February light and watched her walk through the gate without looking back, which was a thing that 10-year-olds did when they were happy, when they trusted the world behind them enough to turn their full attention to the world ahead. The gate closed. The school day began its ordinary clockwork. Clara sat for a moment in the parked car before pulling away and felt the particular quiet that follows a long thing ending. The quiet that is not emptiness, but completion. The silence at the end of a sentence that has been worth every word. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the chest in the Grantford bedroom, the morning light coming through the sheer curtains, the particular quality of the silence there, expectant and patient and alive with something that was not supernatural, but was, in its own way, extraordinary. The ordinary extraordinary of a person who has arranged things carefully for someone they love and is waiting, with all the time in the world, for that person to arrive. She was here. She had arrived. She was standing on solid ground. She thought about what Renata had said, that there might be a moral question, even if not a legal one. She had turned this over many times since November, and arrived each time at the same place. There was no moral question. Not because she was certain of her own rectitude, she was not so confident as that, but because the moral architecture of what had happened was not hers, it was her grandmother's and her grandfather's, The decades of careful, quiet decision-making that had built this thing and stored it and directed it with an intention so clear that it had survived 40 years and 4 children and a false bottom and a woman who had traced the carved flowers as a child and understood, without being told, that some things required patient hands. She had been the patient hands. Whatever was owed by this fortune to the world, and she believed something was, she intended to pay it carefully, in the same order she had always paid things, with the same precision, the same twice-smoothed attention. The scholarship fund was the beginning. There would be more. She was learning, daily, what more meant and what form it should take. So when she was learning it the same way she had always learned the things that mattered, by paying close attention over a long time and trusting the knowledge to arrive. The chest stood in the bedroom of the new house now, against the wall by the east-facing window, where it caught the morning light at a low angle and threw a faint, warm glow across the floorboards. The interior was empty of everything except the cedar smell. The false bottom was latched. She had considered removing it, considered having someone come and take apart the mechanism so that the chest was simply what it appeared to be, a beautiful piece of old furniture with dark wood and iron hinges and carved flowers along the edge. She had decided not to. The false bottom was part of what it was, part of what it had done, a part of the long patience of a thing that had kept its secret until the right person sat down beside it and pressed their palms flat and paid attention. To remove it would be to pretend the chest had not been what it had been, and she had no interest in pretending. Every morning, leaving for school, Lily stopped in the bedroom doorway and said goodbye to it, not always in words, sometimes just a look, the kind of acknowledging look that children give to things they have decided to include in their understanding of home, the inanimate companions of a life. The chest received these looks with the same steady patience it had always had, the same dark wood, the same iron hinges, the same carved flowers along the edge that caught the light differently at each hour of the day, and were always, in some quality she could not define precisely, but recognized completely, exactly what they had always been. Patient, waiting, done with its long work, content at last, simply to be. There are things in this world that look like nothing. A cracked stone by the road, a folded envelope in a drawer, an old wooden chest that smells of cedar, and something older, something that resists naming. People walk past them every day, certain they already know their value. Certain the world has already sorted everything into what matters and what does not. But the world is not as certain as it appears. And some things are meant to find the right person. It takes a while sometimes, but they find them. Clara Voss was 41 years old when her grandmother's linen chest changed her life. She had been working 2 jobs and raising her daughter alone and paying her bills in a careful order and fixing things with what was available and smoothing each crease twice and sitting on the floor next to things that mattered and paying the kind of attention that most people in most hurries do not have the stillness to pay. She had been doing all of this for a long time, without reward and without recognition, and without the knowledge that any of it was being watched or measured or stored in the cedar-scented dark of a false bottom for the right moment. It had been watched. It had been measured. It had been stored. Some people looked at what happened to Clara Voss and called it luck. Some called it inheritance. Some called it the random falling of things that fall without reason. Clara herself did not use any of these words. She used the word her grandmother had used, not often, not loudly, but consistently, for the category of things that were worth the long patience of waiting. She called it hers. And it was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. The spring came early to the garden behind the new house. Clara had planted lilac along the back fence in October, bare root, on a cold afternoon when the soil was still workable, pushing each root carefully into the ground, with the particular faith of someone who plants things they will not see bloom until another season. When she had covered them with mulch and left them to winter's work, and tried not to check on them too often, which she had not entirely succeeded at, but had managed with sufficient restraint that when the first small buds appeared in late March, they came as something close to a surprise. She noticed them on a Saturday morning when she went out to turn the compost, which she had begun over the winter in a small bin in the corner, because composting was the kind of slow, patient transformation of one thing into something useful that appealed to her in a way she did not need to examine too closely. The buds were small and tight and very pale, barely distinguishable from the green of new leaves. She crouched beside the fence and looked at them for a long time, the way she had always crouched and looked at things that deserved it. Lily came out in her pajamas and crouched beside her. "Are those the lilacs?" "Yes. They're small. They'll be bigger." "How do you know?" Clara looked at the small, pale buds and thought about ground that holds what is planted in it, about how things grow in the right conditions, about the patience required to believe in the bloom before it arrives. "Because that's what they do," she said. "If you planted them in good ground and gave them water and waited." Lily looked at the buds for another moment, and then stood up and went inside to make cereal, satisfied with this, because she was the kind of person who accepted that some things required waiting, which was something she had learned from her mother, who had learned it from her grandmother, who had planted it in both of them without saying so directly. So the way the truest things are always planted, quietly and without announcement, in the certainty that they will find their way to the surface in the right season. Clara stayed in the garden a little longer. The morning light came over the back fence and lay across the soil in long, gentle angles. The lilac buds trembled faintly in the early spring air. Somewhere across the garden, a bird made a single clear sound and was answered by another, farther away, and the morning settled into the particular peaceful attention of early spring, when the world is still in the process of deciding whether to open and has not yet committed fully, but is leaning, clearly and irreversibly, toward yes. She pressed her palm flat against the soil beside the roots of the first lilac plant. The ground was cool and firm, dense with whatever winter had done to it, and the slow, invisible chemistry of cold and dark and waiting. She pressed once, then again. Solid, present, prepared for what it was being asked to hold. She stood and went inside to make tea and sit in the light of the east-facing window and begin her Saturday in the easy, unhurried way of someone who has more days ahead of her than she had once allowed herself to believe, which was something she was still learning to receive without looking over her shoulder for the catch, the asterisk, the fine print that took it back. She was learning. It was taking time. She was patient with the learning, the way she was patient with most things, which was to say, she was not always patient, but she kept returning to it, kept smoothing the crease a second time, even when the first seemed sufficient, or kept pressing her palms flat and paying attention to what moved when it should not. Some things are meant to find the right person. She was the right person. She had been the right person all along. She was only now, in the full light of an ordinary morning in a kitchen that was hers, in a house that was hers, with a daughter sleeping upstairs in a room with enough space in it, and lilac buds in the garden, and tea going warm in the cup, and the whole of the day still ahead, learning to receive that fact without apology. It was the last thing her grandmother had given her, not the stones, not the fortune, not the life made larger and steadier and finally proportionate to what she had always been capable of. The last gift was this, the permission to believe, without flinching, that she had been worth waiting for all along. She sat in the morning light and believed it. The tea stayed warm. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.